Dad laughed in my face when I told him that I would tell Grandpa everything about him and his new wife did to me to drive me away from my own home, expecting nothing would come out of it. But I was left stunned when Grandpa showed up to the house with this document in hand. So my dad, 43 male, recently got married to his high school sweetheart Jennifer, 42 female, just 2 years after my mother passed away. For context, my parents would have been together for almost 20 years this year, but unfortunately, my mom had been suffering from cancer for a pretty long time, and she finally lost the battle 2 years back. It was a devastating blow to the family, especially to me, since she was pretty much my favorite person. I never got along with my dad. He was always too distant from me, and I guess to a certain extent from my mother as well. I honestly don't even know why they even got married in the first place, since my dad always seemed to act like he did not want to be a part of the family, and the only reason he was even staying with us was because he had nowhere else to go. It honestly constantly felt like that's what my entire childhood was, and I guess I just never expected anything from him because we never had a real relationship. My parents wouldn't exactly fight, but they didn't seem to be in love either. It was really confusing for me because I would see other families and it would just never make any sense for me. I had even asked my mother about it quite a couple of times after I grew up, but she never gave me a straight answer. In fact, even when I spoke to my grandfather, my mom's dad, he wouldn't tell me anything about it. So I just accepted this as one of the family secrets. I was probably not going to find out about it until much later. After my mom was diagnosed with cancer, these things stopped mattering to me anyway, because it was too insignificant. Anyway, after the diagnosis, my dad completely disconnected from us. It was like he didn't even want to be around the family. He would be gone for most days, saying that he had to work, and he would return really late at night. When my mother's health started getting worse, he made it a point to stay away from the family, as he would often go on business trips to put as much distance between us as he could. I could tell that this did not make my mother feel any better, but I tried to be there for her as much as I could because I did not want her to think about these things. And then she passed away 2 years ago, and it was really difficult because I had just lost my best friend, and on top of that, I would have to deal with the fact that my father and I would still have to live together for the next couple of years because I'm 16 now and there's still a lot of time to go before I start college. And honestly, I'm not even sure if I want to go to college or not because I've been thinking about it and would much rather get some work experience in the real world and then get a degree and whatever I think is appropriate. I just don't want to dive headfirst into whatever people are doing, but that's besides the point. The point is that I'm going to have to live with my father for the next couple of years. Even the thought of it was just so frustrating because I knew that he did not want me around, and honestly, I did not want to live with him either. But I knew that I had to deal with this because I was just 16 and this was my home. I didn't want to leave. Surprisingly enough, the last 2 years were pretty easy and things got challenging in the past 6 months after my dad married Jennifer. Anyway, after my mother passed away, I thought that my dad would be difficult to deal with, but thankfully, he just stuck to his old ways. He would stay out really late for work and would come back home at odd hours. So I did not interact with him much because I would leave for school, and when I would come back, he would not be at home. So our timings of being at home never overlapped. He minded his own business and did not talk to me unless it was absolutely necessary. We lived like we were roommates, as opposed to father and daughter, to be honest. Not even roommates because at least they have to interact at some point, but we would just lead completely separate lives. I did my own cooking, cleaning, and laundry, and he did the same for himself. We did not have much reason to talk to each other. Of course, he took care of all my bills and stuff, and occasionally, I would ask him for money, but most of the time, my grandfather took care of it for me, and that was about it. So things were pretty easy and convenient for both of us, and on the weekends, I would go and visit my grandfather, since he had lost his wife just 5 years ago, and then recently, he had lost his daughter as well. So I just wanted to be there to give him company. Now, I know a lot of you might be wondering why I did not just move in with him permanently, but honestly, my grandfather lives pretty frugally, and I did not want to be a burden on him, because if I moved in with him, he would have to cover twice expenses that he would have to if he was living alone. It was not like he did not ask me to, but I just did not think that it would be wise of me to live with him and force him to spend more money than he needed to, since that would make me feel kinda guilty. He was retired, and he deserved to lead a life of peace, so I refrained and just stayed with my dad instead. And I would have continued if Jennifer had not entered my life and turned it upside down. I didn't even know who Jennifer was up until 10 months back, which is when my dad first started dating her. I thought it was pretty soon, because it had just been little over a year since my mother had passed away at that point in time. But then again, I'm nobody to comment on my dad's love life, and I did not say anything about it. I didn't even find out about it from him directly. I actually just came across a couple of texts on his phone, and they were pretty flirtatious, so I knew what was going on. I did not intend on peeking, but it was just lying there, and I couldn't help but take a peek because I had noticed the heart emoji popping up on his screen. Anyway, even after I had found out, I did not say anything about it. At the time, I did not know how long it had been going for. For all I know, it might have been going on since before my mother had even passed away, but that's none of my concern. I just had to stay with him until I had the means to leave this house, so I was not going to make my life more difficult than it already was. 7 months ago, he finally brought Jennifer home for the first time. I guess before that, they had just gone out on dates, because if he brought her home, he would introduce me to her. Anyway, he was polite enough to introduce us to each other, and it was a very civilized first meeting. Probably the only time that they were nice to me. For 1 month, they continued to have dates, and he would occasionally bring Jennifer home until she finally moved in with us. My father did not tell me anything about it beforehand. One day, she was just there at our doorstep with all her bags and stuff, and I guessed that she was moving in with us. I did not think much of it, because at the time, I was still under this delusion that her moving in with us would not have any impact on me and my life. I assumed that maybe she would just treat me the same way that my father did and let me live on my own terms, since that's how things had been so far. But all of a sudden, things started changing around the house, and not in a good way. It did not take too long for me to figure out what was going on, and I realized that they were trying to make my life difficult on purpose, probably to make me leave so they could have the house all to themselves. After Jennifer moved in, they got married within a week, and they were officially husband and wife. It was a quick court marriage, and they did have a ceremony, but it was really small and intimate. I had kept my grandfather updated on all this ever since I had found out about Jennifer, and he was the one who had told me that Jennifer was my dad's ex-girlfriend and high school sweetheart right before my mother. They had been together until their first year of college, which is where my dad met my mom, and for some reason, he broke up with Jennifer and got together with my mother. After they graduated, my mom got married to my father, and they had assumed that the whole thing was over. Clearly, but evidently, that was the case. I don't know for sure. My dad had been cheating on my mother at any point in time, but I'm assuming that he had never really moved on from Jennifer. I don't even know why he married my mom, to be honest. They were really unhappy, and he seems much happier now. Anyway, Jennifer moved in with us and got married, and things started changing around the house rapidly. She took over my parents and all my mother's belongings, which had not been touched up until that point, were moved to the basement, and so were all the family photos of us. She wiped the house clean of any trace of my mother, and all of a sudden, it was like she had never even lived there. I did not say anything about it, because now that my dad had married her, I guess she could do this, and I tried really hard not to let myself get offended by what she was doing. But then again, she started trying to make life difficult for me, and my dad, in the least surprising turn of events, encouraged it. Whenever she would speak to me, she would be downright nasty and would treat me like I was Cinderella or something, making me do all the chores around the house, and if I refused, she would scream at me until I finally had done it. She would go at me all the time, and every time I exited my room and walked around the house for any purpose, she would constantly make horrible comments about me, about how she wished that I had never even existed, and how she was going to make sure that I left this house in tears. At first, it used to bother me because this was really new and confusing, but eventually, I stopped letting it get under my skin. And just because I knew that I was going to have to live here, because I did not want to be a burden on my grandfather by moving in with him. I would much rather be a burden on somebody that I did not get along with, like my father, and knew that he thought of me as baggage because Jennifer never missed an opportunity to remind me of how my dad was doing me a huge favor by letting me stay with him. Even though I was literally a minor and he absolutely had to let me live with him because otherwise it would be illegal and he would get in trouble. To be fair, even what they were putting me through was not exactly legal since they were torturing a minor, and I'm pretty sure there are laws against that kind of emotional and mental harassment. Anyway, I had made up my mind that no matter how hard they tried, I was not going to let them get to me. And somehow, I was able to make it through the past 6 months with great difficulty. It's not like I did not fight back. I definitely did. But it was pointless because they were pretty stubborn. They knew that they were going to break me somehow, and they were bent on it. They were as horrible to me as could be. But last week, I just couldn't take it anymore, and I told my father that I was going to make sure that I kicked him and his new wife out of the house. I had no idea how I was going to do that. I said it in the heat of the moment because we were having a really bad fight and I wanted to say something to him. So that's the first thing that came out of my mouth. And he seemed pretty pissed off when I said that, so I decided to push even further and I doubled down on what I said. I told him that I knew exactly what he and his wife were trying to do. They were trying to drive me away from my own home because they couldn't stand the fact that I was happy here and wanted me to be miserable. But I was definitely going to turn the tables on them. One day, and as soon as I had the power, I was going to have them kicked out. That's when Jennifer decided to intervene and asked me really snarkily what exactly I plan on doing because as far as they were concerned, they owned this house, and as soon as I turned 18, I was getting kicked out of there. So in the heat of the moment, I ended up saying that I was going to tell my grandfather, and I was sure that he would screw them up. I made a mistake by saying that. At that point, my dad and Jennifer literally started laughing in my face and told me that I could go ahead and do whatever I wanted because there was no way that the old man and I could take the two of them down because we had no money and no claims on anything. It was pointless for us to try, but he would like to go ahead. So that fight ended, but I felt truly insulted and I had decided that I was not going to put up with this anymore, and it was time to finally get back at them. So far, I had not said anything because I didn't want to burden my grandpa because his health hadn't been doing too well for some time. But after that fight, I realized that there was no way I could cope with this on my own for any longer, and I decided to visit my grandpa and tell him what was going on. When I visited him after that fight and told him everything that had been happening for the past 6 months, he seemed stunned and I almost started crying while recounting everything because I had barely even realized how hard it had been for me since I'd just been in survival mode for so long. Anyway, he reassured me that he would definitely do something about it and send me back home with that promise in mind. For the next 2 days, nothing happened and I started losing hope, but then my grandfather showed up to our house with certain documents in hand. And that's what really took me by surprise. Not just me, but my dad and Jennifer also looked pretty confused that day. My father straight up refused to let my grandfather enter the house. So I had to go out and stand beside him in front of the yard. When my grandfather opened the documents, he told me that these were the papers that showed whom the house actually belonged to. And to my shock, the deed had my grandfather's name on it, not my mother's. It finally made sense to me why my mother had not specified whom she was leaving the house to in her will, because it did not belong to her in the first place, so she couldn't leave it to anybody. I was more shocked that my grandfather had owned this house all along because he never said anything about it. Anyway, when he brought out those documents, he told my father that now that he knew the truth, he wanted to tell him that he had 1 week to pack up his things and move out, because now that he had found out how he was treating me, along with his new wife, his home had no room for him anymore. My father tried to argue with him and even offered to buy the house from him, but my grandfather stood firm on his point and told my father that he had to leave because what he had done was absolutely pathetic and he was not going to tolerate it. So there it was. Karma was finally hitting back and my father and Jennifer had nowhere to go. As of now, they're still in that house and I'm living with my grandfather, but they have to vacate the place in 1 week. A lot of you might be wondering why my grandfather had not said anything about owning the property before this happened, because he had always known that my father and I did not get along particularly well. So he could have offered to let me move in with him as well, but he did not, because apparently it was my mother who had wished that I live with my dad, at least until I had to go to college and move out for that. She believed that her demise would bring us closer, together as a family, and had passed away, still laboring under that delusion. I love my mother, bless her heart, but she was so wrong about that. It might have worked out if my dad was a decent human being, but he's not, so it's not really my fault. My grandfather, for a really long time, had tried to restrain himself, even though he knew by the looks of it that I was not doing too well at that house while living with my father. Even though all my needs were met, I was not loved in that house, and that's the worst part of all. And there was also the fact that I thought that I would be a burden on him, which is why I did not speak up earlier. Apparently, I did not have to worry about that, because he just lives through and that's the way he was brought up. But in reality, he doesn't really have to worry about money since he retired. He saved up a lot before that happened, and he has even invested in a couple of businesses that are doing pretty well. So he's never going to run short of money in the coming future. So I don't have to worry about that, and if I had just conversed with him about this one time, I would have realized it. But I did not think that it was appropriate for me to talk to him about money, so I did not bring it up. That was my mistake. Anyway, that's all being sorted out now. I haven't found out why exactly my parents got married. My grandfather is suspiciously tight-lipped about it, but I'll get to the bottom of it. Right now, the thing that I'm most worried about is that my father is acting weird. After that day that my grandfather told him that he had to move out of the house, he completely lost his mind and has been texting me and calling me every single day to tell me to fix the situation because he has nowhere else to go. He's apologizing to me like crazy and is telling me that he's really sorry and he's going to change, including Jennifer. But I just need to speak to my grandfather and reverse this decision that he has made. I just don't know what to do, and I've never seen my dad act this desperate about anything, so that's much worse. Truth be told, I don't want anything to change. I want them to get kicked out of the house so that my grandfather and I can live there. He's making a lot of good points as well, that soon enough I will be going away for college and stuff, but I don't really care about any of that. So, am I the a-hole for wanting my dad and his new wife to get kicked out of the house that they are living in right now so that I can have it? I have read the comments and I'm trying to respond to all of you right now, but there are a lot of comments, so just bear with me. Anyway, I spoke to my grandfather about the text that my dad had been sending me. I told him that he was apologizing like crazy, and I didn't know what to do. I feel like a bad person for ignoring all that. My grandfather told me to do the obvious thing and block him, just like most of you did as well. The thing is, I feel bad about blocking him as well, because he's just been so desperate. He sent me loads of voice notes as well, and I can literally hear the desperation in his voice. And I am really not that hard-hearted. I just can't bring myself to block him and move on with my life. Even if I do block him, I'll just keep playing in my head that I'm not the kind of person who can do that. The most that I could do, however, was speak to my grandfather and extend the time that he had given to him. He had given them 1 week to look for a new place and move out, but after I spoke to him, I managed to make him change that to 1 month. So for 1 month, we're gonna live here, and they have enough time to look for a new home that they can live in. But after that, they're going to have to move out. I communicated that to my father, and I told him that with great difficulty, I managed to convince my grandfather to do this. It was foolish of me that I expected my dad to be thankful. I thought that he would thank me, but as soon as I texted him this, he told me that this was not good enough and that I had to try and convince my grandfather to reverse his decision entirely. He said that he wanted to live in that house and that was his home. It had been so for so many years, and he couldn't just leave. Now it was my duty to make sure that he and Jennifer didn't get kicked out, and I had to make sure it worked out for them, by hook or by crook. I got pissed off after reading that message, and realized that I should have just listened to everyone else, because this was pretty pointless. So after that conversation I blocked him, because I had realized that being nice to him was absolutely useless. He was just going to stick to his point and not budge. Anyway, once I had blocked him, I told my grandfather that I had communicated the fact that there was 1 month to go now, and now it was up to him whether he wanted to look for another place until then, or if he just wanted to waste his time. I can't do anything about it, so I'm just letting this go. As for why they even got married in the first place, I did talk to my grandfather about it, and the reason for it is still very confusing to me. If Jennifer was an ex-girlfriend right before he married Mom, then he should have just stuck to her instead of flitting between the two. And I had seen them after marriage. They did not look too happy with each other. so it did not make sense to me. Anyway, the explanation that my grandfather gave me was not quite satisfactory, but that's all that I have to go on right now. So basically, my grandfather told me that they had started dating in the early years of their college life, and my mother had been really into him, but not so much. He had guessed that it might have been because of the money, since my mother came from a pretty rich family. I did not know about it in my entire life, because my grandfather lived so frugally, but my dad had known about it, so that might have been one reason for that. My grandfather did not really tell me anything. I am guessing that my dad had probably been with my mother for the money, but my mom probably fell in love with him eventually. So that's all that I know as of now. Anyway, the bottom line is that he's with Jennifer now, and it hasn't even been a respectable amount of time since my mother passed away. I don't know for sure if he had any contact with Jennifer before my mother was sick, and now, honestly, even if he did have contact with her beforehand, it does not matter because she has gone, and I'm gonna make sure that they leave that house as well. We just have to wait for another month because of my kindness. So there's just 1 week to go before 1 month is completed, and today I decided to unblock my dad and speak to him about it. My grandfather did not want to talk to him, so he delegated that to me. When I contacted him, I decided to do it via text because I knew that if I tried to call him, he would just waste my time. So when I texted him, I got straight to the point and asked him if he had found a place to live or not, because either way, my grandfather and I would be showing up at our house in a couple of days and he needed to be gone by then. He did not respond for a couple of hours, but this evening, just about an hour ago, he told me that he was not leaving and that he had already spoken to a lawyer and was going to make sure that we did not get the house. He said that he had been living in this house for so many years, he was not ready to leave yet, and there was no way that we were going to force him to do so. He told me that he had wanted to talk to me about this, but I had blocked him, so there was no way that he could contact me. But now that I had finally reached out to him, he could tell me what his intentions were regarding the house. He told me that my grandfather and I could fight him in court if we wanted to, but apart from that, there was no way he was letting us in. I don't understand how he's going to work this out, because my grandfather literally has the deed to the house, and I don't even know what lawyer would ever agree to fight a case like this. But when I told my grandfather, he did not seem to worry, so I'm trying not to worry about it either. He might just be bluffing, so that's what we think is going on right now. Either way, we will be showing up at his doorstep in just 1 week, and then we'll see what happens. So, a couple of days ago, my grandfather and I showed up at the house. Like we had promised, my father and Jennifer were still there unfortunately, so we had to interact with them. My grandfather told them that we had given them 1 month to leave the house, but they still hadn't done that, and now we have been left with no other option but to use force. My father tried to argue with him once again and said that 1 month was barely enough and that he had been living in this place for so many years, and my mother had me and my dad live here together. Probably another attempt to emotionally manipulate me back, but that was not going to happen. I told him that there was no way that I was moving back in with him and Jennifer, and that he should just feel that we even gave him 1 month. So that was a bit of an argument at that point, and finally, this time my grandfather told him that he was ready to fight him in court if that's what it came to make sure that the house was emptied. And I guess at that point, my dad kind of figured that he couldn't lie his way out of this anymore, and was forced to concede that he didn't actually get a lawyer. After he had confessed to that, my grandfather was able to convince him that leaving the house would be the best option for him right now. So basically, we just gave him 1 more week to pack his things up. At this time, he is actually leaving. And that's our victory, because now the house finally goes back to where it actually belongs. That was a wrap up for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Smash the like button for me and subscribe for more stories. Thanks again. We'll be seeing you in the next one.